In this lecture, we're going to be looking at Japanese religion in practice, in particular focusing on the relationship between Buddhism and Shinto, the two major religious traditions of Japan. But I want to start by thinking about the distinction between deductive and inductive reasoning, because that will really help us to understand how Japanese people can think about these two different traditions, Buddhism and Shinto, really working seamlessly together despite having some rather significant different perspectives. It's closely related to what we talked about in the Confucianism lecture right at the end. I was talking about how in China there's no clear distinction between the secular world and some kind of sacred other realm. Everything is integrated in a seamless kind of way. And so you could have Confucianism focusing on society, and you could have Taoism focusing on cosmic power and how to bring that into your life and live in a flowing kind of a way, without any strong distinction between them. You don't have to feel like you choose between one or the other, but rather they're two different areas of life, and they together make up a kind of religious response of the Chinese people. Of course, Buddhism will also enter into China approximately 2,000 years ago, and gradually it will become an important tradition in China and will be added to the other two, so we get all three in China. So this is a different approach to the same issue, and we're going to focus on it as it pertains to Japan, but it's equally true for China. And that is to think about how in the West we tend to look at things in a deductive way. That's thanks to Plato and Aristotle, in large part, that they establish some foundational principles for how we ought to be thinking, and those have carried through in our tradition and continue to be very strong. And so what you see there is you begin with a premise, and you assume that the premise is true because you can't prove everything, and so you have to have some starting point, and that's important because we can never really prove all of the premises. But then you use deduction, reason, and logic to come up with theories, and then you can test those theories, and you're aiming for some ultimate sense of truth. And so truth becomes very important in this Western approach to reasoning, that we want to know that the answers that we come up with are absolutely and ultimately true. And we can see that a lot in our religious traditions, the Abrahamic traditions. If we look at inductive reasoning, which is more dominant in the countries of the East, then we can see you're starting with data. You're starting with, I observe the world around me, and then once I do that, by looking at those patterns over and over, I may come up with some possible explanations. And I can then take those, work them into theory, and come up with some ideas about why things are the way they are. But ultimately, what the primary focus is on is practice. In the end, it's not about coming up with the one single, absolutely true explanation for the universe, but rather to come up with some frameworks that can be applied in practice and turn out to be effective. And if they are effective, then that is a kind of truth, right? In practice, they really work. Whether they are logically consistent is not as much of a concern. And so that's one of the reasons why we can see these mixtures of different traditions, and nobody is particularly concerned or even looks to see if they match up in every single aspect. As long as the theory looks like it's okay, works in practice, that's great. So if we go back to this belief, practice, experience Venn diagram, we can think about it this way, that traditions such as the Abrahamic traditions that focus on belief, practice and experience might flow from them, but the idea is you must first believe the right thing, right? You first have to believe that there's one monotheistic God that created everything, and from that we could deduce the other parts of the religion, and then you put it into practice, right? You try and base your practices on what you think are true, and then the kinds of religious experiences that you have will flow from that. But in the East, we tend to see the other way around. Much more focus on if we do certain practices and have certain experiences, then belief can be part of that. But the belief isn't the most important part of that. What's more important is that when we're actually practicing these things, that we get to the right kinds of religious experiences. And from that flows the idea of what we ought to believe in. In general, less of an emphasis that you have to believe in the same thing that I believe in, right? So if you start with belief, and it's important that everyone believes in God, then we might feel that you have to go around and tell others that they also should believe in God. Because if they don't, it tends to undermine our own belief that God is really the one absolute answer. But from this other perspective, there's very little interest in making sure that everyone believes the same thing, because everybody can take the information and develop their own versions of it. As long as those practices are working for other people, then that's fine. As we'll see, there are some generalizable patterns that we will find in different countries, in this case Japan. But we're going to have to leave that for class. There's a PowerPoint here. I don't want you to bother with that because it's going to talk about the relationship between Buddhism and Shinto, and I need to really go through that argument in class, and it would probably be confusing. If you want, you can look at the images, but you might not be able to understand the argument I'm trying to make. Similarly, I've got a video that we need to watch in class because I couldn't get an online version of it. But for now, since we've been talking about how practice and experience is the most important thing, I want you to end by clicking that image, and it will allow you to, in practice, walk through these beautiful gates at the Inari Shrine in Kyoto, Japan.